Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Justice Subcommittee on Policing. This is our 11th meeting of 2020, and we have no apologies. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking item in private, and that's to review the evidence we've heard today. Are we all agreed? If you disagree, members, please indicate to me or use the chat function. I'm not seeing any dissent to that, so we'll hold that item in private. And we now move to agenda item 2, which is policing during the coronavirus pandemic. And I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. John Scott, QC, Solicitor Advocate, Chair of the Independent Advisory Group on Police Use of Temporary Powers related to the coronavirus crisis, and Professor Susan McVeigh, a member of the Independent Advisory Group. And I invite Mr Scott to make some brief opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for scheduling this meeting to allow both Professor McVeigh and I to attend. The headline from our work, as will be seen from the reports which are publicly available and which the committee has, is that Police Scotland continues to have very good awareness of the human rights aspects of the emergency powers and to have due regard to those and also to Police Scotland's values. Police Scotland continues to recognise the additional responsibilities which come with these powers and also the need for additional transparency and scrutiny which should accompany such powers. It is important to recall that the idea for the group came from within Police Scotland and was then given very good support and ongoing support by the Scottish Police Authority as the main scrutiny body. And I mention in particular Eleanor Gaw of the authority, who has been fantastic in working the Secretariat. We also get good support from Police Scotland through the optical group chaired by Assistant Chief Constable Gary Ritchie, which means that when there's particular aspects of data or information that we want, there's a conduit for that and we get what we need. We reach into Police Scotland and hear from divisional commanders as well, so it's not just the executive team, but we hear from divisional commanders about what's happening in their areas. And we heard from, for example, the North East commander when the local lockdown was introduced in Aberdeen. The conclusion, I suppose, from our work is that there's been a big ask of the public and Police Scotland since March of this year, and that both have responded exceptionally well to it. The adherence by the public has been very good, and Police Scotland have recognised that, especially where there are frequent changes in the relevant regulations, there's going to be good faith mistakes, and therefore the 4Es approach, which has worked throughout, continues. And where I've been critical of some of the media portrayals of what's happened during the pandemic, because it's frankly easier to show people breaching regulations than it is to show millions of people adhering, I mentioned one headline which caught my eye since our last appearance, and this was on the 20th of August in the Times. Coronavirus in Scotland, police spoke with public about rules 62,000 times, and that for me really sums it up. It was speaking with people, it was engaging, it was explaining, it was encouraging. Enforcement's only a very small part of it, which in a public health situation is exactly how it should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for these opening remarks, Mr Scott. That's very helpful, and obviously we've a range of questions for yourself and Professor McVeigh. Professor McVeigh, would you care to make some brief opening remarks, please?
Yes, thank you. Data has been core to the strategy of the UK and devolved governments in addressing the pandemic, and in policing terms, data has tended to focus on the use of fixed penalty notices, especially in England and Wales, where there has been no other data available. In Scotland, the swift creation of the coronavirus intervention system by Police Scotland has ensured that not only do we have up-to-date trends on enforcement, but we also have information on wider policing practice in terms of the first 3 E's, that's engagement, explanation and encouragement. So that's enabled the advisory group to evaluate the use of enforcement in its wider context. And it has been noted before, but I think it is worth reiterating to this committee that the CBI system is unique and provides an insight into the use of 4E's policing approach that can't be replicated anywhere else in the UK, nor to my knowledge internationally. Up until the 18th of November this year, there were just shy of 88,000 interventions recorded by Police Scotland on the CBI system, of which 5.8% involved use of a fixed penalty notice and 0.5% involved the use of an arrest. So enforcement continues to represent a very small proportion of all COVID-related policing activity. This is in keeping with the human rights perspective on the use of enforcement and in line with Police Scotland's approach to policing by consent. Much of our focus over the last few months has been on the initial lockdown phase, and in my first data report to the SPA, I highlighted considerable differences across Scotland in the use of the powers, with higher rates in the west of Scotland and less in the north and the east. As we know, rates of the disease have spread at different rates across the country, with higher rates in the west of Scotland, and this hints at a localised policing response that has been proportionate to the need for greater use of police intervention in some parts of the country. But my analysis also found relative use of the 4Es in terms of low level of enforcement was very similar across 13 divisions, which hints at a consistent approach following one national strategy, which is in line with police fairness. My second data report to the SPA looked at a bespoke data set containing information on fixed penalty notices, which found that there were some issues of concern around the deprivation and the criminal history profile those individuals who were issued with a fixed penalty notice. But it is important to recognise that the data don't necessarily reflect any unfairness or disproportionality in the policing approach, but they do raise some important questions about why certain individuals have been less likely or willing to comply with the regulations. We continue to use data and evidence to support the work of around policing. We are looking at the moment at a more in-depth piece of analysis around the individuals who were issued with fixed penalty notices. We're looking at the outcomes of fixed penalty notices that were issued in terms of payment of fines, comparing that to non-COVID related fines. We're in discussion with Police Scotland about some further work looking at this most recent second wave of the pandemic, because we have strong reason to suspect that the profile and the circumstances of individuals who were issued with fixed penalty notices are very different to the first.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Professor McVeigh. And can also, before we start the questions, thank those who have provided written evidence to the subcommittee, as it's very helpful in advising our deliberations. Now, I'll start the questions, but before moving there, can I just remind members to indicate who their question is for, please? And remind all attendees to wait just a moment for your microphone to be activated before speaking. If I could come to Mr. Scott first. Mr. Scott, we're some way down the line now since the initial lockdown back in March, and you touched on your overall assessment of the way that Police Scotland have interpreted, or could I ask you to maybe comment more on how Police Scotland have interpreted the powers that have been granted them? You talked, I think, used the term a good awareness. Can you talk maybe a bit more about their interpretation and use of the power, please?
Absolutely. Well, of course, within the regulations, proportionality and necessity are explicitly mentioned, and these are key human rights concepts, so that they're built into the regulations. And actually, how they are best implemented is through the use of the 4Es, because if you spend the time necessary in engagement, explanation and encouragement, then you take significant steps towards ensuring that enforcement only happens where it is necessary and proportionate. So I think it's really built in to the 4Es. We've also, however, as part of our work, we hear from a wide variety of experts in the fields of policing, but also in relation to human rights, for example, protests and assemblies, and that was obviously an issue over the summer months. These discussions around human rights concepts obviously feed into the work of the group, and then they are part of the ongoing discussions that we have on table and off table with Police Scotland. So I can see that it's more than just the oath that police constables take that refers to human rights. It is actually human rights in practice as we see it.
Thank you. And given the fluidity of events, the changing and indeed the differential approaches and taken in terms of the public health response, how will the Independent Advisory Group ensure that the powers afforded the police continue to be used necessarily and proportionately?
Well, it's more of the same, I suppose. It's because we've seen that the 4Es approach has been adopted at the outset and then maintained throughout. And the different approaches in different areas, for example, still, and where some areas are under more severe restrictions than others, the 4Es approach is actually even more important then. That's where it's at its best. In areas where there are few restrictions, then it may be that the even engagement is not a frequent occurrence. It's more likely to be an occurrence where there are restrictions in place and where police resources and capacity allow a visible presence. And obviously, as this committee, beyond others, would be aware, the return to normal levels of normal policing demands makes that more difficult. A visibility specifically around the pandemic is difficult to achieve. But it really is about the 4Es. Now, what has changed to perhaps an extent is emphasis, and that where there have been breaches of restrictions, whether when they were national restrictions or at more local level, which were more egregious breaches, or where they were repeated breaches, people simply refusing to engage or to listen to explanation or to encouragement. In those situations, that's where enforcement happened. And in some of those situations, the 4Es were gone through rather more quickly, if, for example, it was a repeat example.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Scott. Can I maybe touch on something else that you briefly touched on in your initial remarks, and that was about protests. The Scottish Human Rights Commission have submitted evidence to the subcommittee in relation to Article 11, the freedom of peaceful assembly. And given the possibilities of protests in relation to a number of issues, the COVID restrictions themselves, and indeed Black Lives Matter, where Article 11 may have been engaged, has the Independent Advisory Group given any consideration to this particular matter and how Police Scotland would be expected to engage with the public on that matter?
We have, and in fact, Scotland already engage in these matters. We heard evidence from Michael Rosey, who has been doing work around some of the pre-pandemic protests and marches. So it clearly is an important issue, and it's a situation where, on one view, the police have got two possibilities, because there's the coronavirus restrictions, which would allow them to say there's not going to be any protests, there's not going to be any assemblies. And on the other hand, there is the right to freedom of assembly. And in our view, Police Scotland got the balance right. Trying to prevent protest or assembly, even in a time of pandemic, would be too extreme a measure. It would not have been necessary or proportionate. And a great deal of these events, assemblies, protests, were extremely well organised, with people wearing masks and observing social distancing. Now, of course, not all were, and then a slightly different approach was required. I've seen criticism that some of these protests were allowed to take place, but it was right. Diego Quiroz of the Commission prepared an initial version of that paper for our group, and it has informed our work, and we specifically said in an earlier report that we think that the correct balance was struck, that it would have been unnecessary and disproportionate to have said we are having no protests or marches. And we have seen some of the problems south of the border with other approaches than the approach here. So I think Police Scotland got it right.
Okay, many thanks indeed for that, Mr. Scott. Our next series of questions are from Fulton McGregor. Fulton, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. The first question I'd like to direct towards Professor McVeigh, please. And I suppose it's just in addition to your opening statement, I wonder if you can provide the subcommittee with an overview of the research that was undertaken by yourself and colleagues in compiling the data that featured in the recent interim reports, and perhaps elaborate a bit more on the scope and the purpose of the research. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the research that has been carried out has involved two principal data sets, as I mentioned in my introductory statement. the coronavirus intervention system was put in place very quickly by Police Scotland, and it collects information from officers themselves on their use of the interventions. So that includes engagement with communities, explanation and encouragement to return home, but also includes information on use of enforcement around fixed penalty notices and arrests. And then the fixed penalty notice data that I mentioned in my introductory statement is a more bespoke data set that was created by Police Scotland by using all of the paper tickets that were collected by police officers in the issuing of fixed penalty notices. So the research is predominantly focused on those two data sets, although we have also looked at some wider data on incidents, for example, other police incidents that were recorded on police systems, and some data on complaints. The main strategy around the data and evidence collection has been in order to try and identify policing practice and how that policing practice has been impacted during the course of the pandemic, which of course especially during that initial lockdown phase, there was a large impact in relation to incidents of crime and other non-crime related calls coming into the police, and trying to identify, using these data sets, whether there are any particular issues of concern in relation to proportionality of policing or fairness or effectiveness of policing. We have to a certain extent been constrained by the data that's available, but it is considerably more data than has been available in other parts of the UK, which has been very interesting and produced some significant insights for us. I'm happy to say more about specific aspects of the research if you'd like me to do that.
Well, I think that's okay for now, Professor McVeigh, because I think I understand that the colleagues have got some further questions in that area. If I can move on to John Scott QC, and please excuse my voice this moment, I had to cough there. I want to ask a wee bit about the travel restrictions, John Scott, that the First Minister introduced last week and became law. Can you tell me what plans the IAG have to monitor how travel restriction regulations are to be implemented by Police Scotland, and how the number of people travelling from high prevalence to low prevalence areas is to be monitored? And I suppose as a general supplementary to that, do you see any issues for Police Scotland resulting from these travel restrictions being moved from guidance to legislation?
Thank you, Mr McGregor. Absolutely. We've had discussion for some time about travel restrictions, which, as indicated, became part of the regulation as opposed to guidance on Friday of last week. And a big part of our discussions were around the idea of enforcement realism and also adherence realism, because the reality now, as opposed to the height of lockdown back in April and May, is that significant numbers of people are entitled quite legitimately to be out and about on the road, whether that is because of, but for work purposes, for care purposes, or other essential purposes. For example, one difference between now and the earlier stages of lockdown is that the courts are staying open, and so I'm due to attend Glasgow High Court tomorrow. I live in Edinburgh, I'm going to be travelling through to Glasgow. But perhaps more significantly, the jury, when they receive their citations, they'll be expected to travel out to the cinema in Brainhead, which is the remote jury centre. And that wasn't something that was happening before. So there's far more people legitimately entitled to be out and about. So it makes the policing of that simply impossible, I think. It's an example of something that is unworkable, other than in those situations where, if the police happen to, if someone comes to the attention of the police for some other reason, then it may be possible that a breach of the travel regulations would come into play as well. Or there may be egregious examples. I think examples given of minibuses that mentioned a particular football club being found in an entirely different part of the country, something like that. That might allow officers to intervene, but the police haven't been given any more officers or more resources. They are also being affected now more than at the earlier stages of lockdown by officer absence. And they don't have more police patrol vehicles. And we've also heard of the situation in Melbourne. They actually did a roadblock round the city. And some public polling suggests that roadblocks are quite popular with a significant minority of the population. But the chaos that was caused by these roadblocks, which will bring me on to your question about implications for Police Scotland, but was considerable. Because of the number of people that even there, at the height of their lockdown, were entitled to be out and about for essential purposes or emergency purposes. But what it meant is that all those people who were entitled to be out were caught in a queue of traffic waiting to get to the roadblock, and also caught up in the queue of traffic then were, for example, emergency vehicles. So it caused absolute bedlam. And I think for those that think that roadblocks are a good idea, it would be useful to study the Melbourne example, because one of the implications that it had for policing there was a dent in public confidence. There were those people that thought, oh, well, we need the roadblocks. But as soon as it happened and it caused chaos, people were saying, why are the police doing this? So it's probably an example of be careful what you wish for. But the travel regulations, I understand that there's a message in the regulations, but actually in terms of enforceability, I don't see that it really is. And the police approach is, I think, entirely appropriately going to be a reactive one. It's not going to be proactive policing with roadblocks or stopping people on the M8 or anything like that. It would be counterproductive. It might dent public confidence. And the reality is that a lot of the time they would simply be delaying people who were legitimately entitled to be out on the road. So it's been part of our discussions in terms of monitoring any fixed penalty notices for breach of the travel regulations are going to form part of our weekly data update from Police Scotland through the optical group. So if there's been any since last Friday, I would expect that we'll hear about that this Thursday.
So in summary, do you think that the travel regulations coming into law are not really that useful in the general, apart from the message that you said, which I do think is very important, but that for specific examples, they may well be useful for the police, and obviously we'll need to see how that goes. So, for example, you gave an example of football supporters on a bus. So if the police were made aware of specific breaches at that sort of level, these regulations would be useful there.
Those are the sort of situations where it's going to be able to operate, and really only those sort of situations. Or, for example, if there was a road traffic accident and it turned out through checking people's details that someone was there from Aberdeen in Glasgow, for example, or something like that, then questions might be asked. But I expect that there will be a significant number of people legitimately entitled to be in their vehicles and on the road, and therefore until we can come up with some sort of device to be able to tell who's legitimately on the road and who's not, and advanced though some technology is, we're not there yet, it's not going to be workable for the majority of the time.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Fulton. Our next series of questions are from James Kelly. James, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Can I just put my first question to Professor McVey? I just wondered, Professor, in terms of the reports that you provided, if you were surprised at some of the outcomes. For example, earlier in your initial remarks, you noted that there had been 88,000 interventions, but of those, there was a very small number of fixed penalty notices, around 5%. And the rest were numbered less than 1% of that 88,000. So did the outcomes surprise you in any way?
Proportionate use of enforcement are not a surprise given the consistent messaging from the Chief Constable around use of the 4Es strategy. I think it is worth noting that in the initial 2 or 3 weeks after the introduction of the police powers, there was quite a lot of variation across the country in terms of use of enforcement, and it was being used proportionately more in some places than others, but that was in the period before that 4Es approach was really kind of filtered through into standard policing practice. And from the very early stages, after those initial 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen a fairly consistent level of enforcement at somewhere between kind of 4 to 8% of all interventions over the entire period. So I think that's not necessarily surprising, given the strong emphasis on only using enforcement in those on those occasions where there's a flagrant breach of the coronavirus powers regulations, rather. It's very difficult to say how surprising it might be, because there's absolutely nothing to compare it to. There are no other systems that measure the wider extent of all policing activity compared to Scotland. So, but I think that it definitely is consistent.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Professor. That's helpful. Can I turn to Mr. Scott? And I just wanted to put to you, we're obviously in a situation now where we've got a single police force, so therefore officers are operating on all parts of the country, and we've got a tier system where there are different sets of restrictions in place in different local authorities. And in some cases, those can be, close borders. So does that present any challenge or concern for the police, the fact that they've got to be able to operate with these different restrictions in different areas, but they're operating across the different?
Thanks, Mr. Kelly. It certainly produces challenges, and especially where some changes are introduced with very little notice, with very often the regulations only published the day before, or the travel regulations were published last Friday, sometime between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and came into force at 6 o'clock. I think we've only come across one example where the regulations were published the day after, so that obviously makes it very difficult for the police to make sure that the regulations have properly been digested. And I appreciate that they will have early sight of draft versions of them, make sure it's properly understood and then disseminated at the local level. There appears to us to be very good cooperation between police divisional commanders, for example, and their local authorities. And so there is coordination, and things happening quickly allows scope for perhaps confusion. Individual constables who maybe haven't quite got to grips with particular changes, and also individual members of the public who can entirely understandably and in good faith still be a bit confused about what applies. But that's again where we go back to the 4Es approach, so that there's not a starting presumption that when people are in a situation where they may be in breach of the regulations, they're doing that deliberately. The starting presumption, in effect, is they might be doing it inadvertently. It might be a good faith example, or it might be a mistake. And engagement allows that to be flushed out. And then explanation and encouragement as well for anyone that maybe needs a wee bit more of a prompt. I mean, obviously, there's been an increase in the number of voices saying there shouldn't be any restrictions at all. So it may be that some breaches of regulations are now more willful. But at a local level, when we spoke to the divisional commander who just come into post in the North East, it struck us that he had a very clear understanding of what the particular restrictions were in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. And actually, one of the things that struck us was that the messaging there really went wider than the regulations. The regulations were really pretty much aimed at premises rather than individuals in that earlier lockdown. But what happened is that people did what they thought was the right thing. They complied with the guidance, and that's actually a lot of the time, probably most of the time, what people are doing. So people aren't necessarily, there may be confusion about what's the law and what's guidance, but people are trying to stick to the guidance as far as possible. That makes the job of policing easier, and it means that in those situations where there's some perhaps possible confusion because of slight differences or big differences in proximate geographical areas, these are usually dealt with by way of explanation, and people are then allowed to go about their business and go home without a fixed penalty notice for having, gone from where they stay to the next town where something's different by way of regulations.
Thanks for that, Mr. Scott. Yeah, I think clarity and early communication on the regulations with those that have got to enforce them and also the public is absolutely key here. So back to yourself, convener.
Thank you, James. Our next questions are from Liam MacArthur. Liam, can I ask that you, I know you have a number of questions, can you ask that you pause after your first question, following which I'll bring Margaret Mitchell in. Margaret will ask her question, then I'll come back to you for your subsequent questions. So next question's from Liam MacArthur. Liam, please.
Thanks very much. Convener, you've thrown me a bit of a curveball, because what John Scott was just talking about there was a neater segue onto the questions I was going to ask him. So are you hoping that I was to ask my question to Professor McVie?
No, please continue. Margaret was wanting to come in after the first question you were scheduled to ask. So if you're going to ask the other two, that would work fine.
I'm probably going to do them in reverse order just because of what's preceded. So hopefully that'll be a better segue for Margaret. Good morning, Mr. Scott and Professor McVie. I was going to start with questions to John Scott. He talked there about something the very truncated timeframes between regulations being passed, or the details being published, and then being enforced. Obviously, what we're often getting are statements within Parliament, and sometimes to the media, about the direction of travel, whereupon the public are aware of that and then looking for the more granular details. I just wondered whether or not there were any concerns that have been flagged up about the time lag between where the public becomes aware of those changes and those actually coming into effect. And in addition to that, certainly I'm aware that Police Scotland have referred to the extent that very often complaints that are made about contraventions are born of pre-existing neighbourhood disputes or whatever, and how, where there is engagement and education and encouragement rather than enforcement, that in a sense leads to a lack of public confidence amongst those who very much want to see the book thrown at those that have been complained against.
Mr. MacArthur, yes, I'm not convinced that at this stage of the pandemic, statements in Parliament or statements by the First Minister at the press briefings, followed then by the detail of the regulations a few days later, is a good enough way of working. Now, I appreciate that some things can come up so quickly that urgent action is required, and I take my hat off to those who are drafting the legislation, because my understanding is that sometimes they're drafting something within the 24 hours before it's due to come into force, which explains why mistakes are made there. I didn't, before all of this happened, know about correction slips, but if you will all, of course, be aware of these. But on the legislation.gov website, which I visit almost daily now, sometimes to try and find regulations that I know are just about to come into force without success, the number of correction slips because of mistakes that have been made, simple errors that have been made in regulations. So that sort of thing can happen very easily. And actually, although public polling suggests that in Scotland there's a better understanding of the rules, and that there's more confidence in the messaging. In England, there's been various things that have happened by the nature of fiascos that have caused all sorts of problems there, but it still strikes me as not good enough. We don't need to be in emergency mode all the time just now. The tier system, I think, was maybe a way of trying to address that, so that there's perhaps a not entirely unlimited range of contingencies. And if this happens, we'll go this way. If this happens, we'll go that way. But from the point of view of policing, it's important to know what are the regulations. And the regulations are changing sometimes right up until the last minute. And where fixed penalty notices can, of course, in the enforcement, albeit it's way down the line of that's the fourth of the 4 E's, and there's probably a gap between the 3 and then the 4th E, it's some way down the line. But the Police Scotland need to understand what is a regulation and what is the guidance. Until they see the regulations, until that's been understood and disseminated and subject to guidance, very difficult for them to do that. So I've said before, and I think when I was at this committee before, that there's better ways of doing it. And for example, having drafts of regulations available a few days in advance even, rather than just before they come into force. It's not a good way of doing it. There's actually a respectable argument that something's not really the law properly if you can't, with the assistance of a lawyer, find out what it is. And there have been plenty of times over the past several months where I've been trying to find out and I've not been able to do it. As I say, I don't think we've been getting it but as badly wrong as in England, but we don't need to be in emergency mode all the time. On the point about public confidence and effectively the 4 E's approach, maybe denting public confidence because people want to see enforcement, I think there's an element of that. There's a significant minority percentage of people, but probably it's grown over the last several months, who want to see more enforcement, by which of course they mean more enforcement against other people. They don't mean themselves. Everyone has their own kind of wee exceptions carved out, as Professor Reicher has said. It's not so much the massive transgressions, it's a lot of smaller ones. So people want to see more enforcement against others. That's not, in the majority of cases, going to be a good enough reason to just go straight to the 4th E for the sake of satisfying those people who want to see that, perhaps driven by longer standing disputes. Public confidence is important, but pandering to those that want to see more is a risky path, just as pandering to those who want to see none is a risky path. And again, on balance, I think Police Scotland get it right.
That's very helpful, and in relation to that last point, I was interested in your observation that, in the sense, there may be a growing minority, but a growing number within that minority who are proving resistant or challenging of really any restriction, or certainly the extent of the restrictions we've seen. I mean, obviously, these are emergency powers. You've already, I think, highlighted some consensus about us being in emergency mode. And I suppose for as long as the emergency powers are there, there's a temptation to use them. And we've passed into law at the moment provisions that Police Scotland have made abundantly clear that they haven't an intention to proactively enforce in relation to the travel restrictions. But it kind of raises, I suppose, questions about whether or not maintaining these emergency powers as they currently stand in law is a good thing. Police Scotland have made clear that these weren't powers necessarily they were seeking. So is there enough of a challenge function there that these powers will only remain in place for as long as and to the extent that they're absolutely needed?
I think the review mechanisms in place, and probably over the last while, an increasing appetite on the part of the Parliament and its committees to say, well, wait a minute, why and for how long? I think that will keep us right on it. I mean, in general terms, most of the restrictions that are introduced are being reviewed on, I think it's a 3-weekly basis by the government. And I mean, in effect, I suppose at the moment we're looking at restrictions that we think to some extent are likely to be in place until the spring. But I think it is important. I suppose the test of that is to see that there are some of these restrictions which are removed after the 3 weekly reviews. I'm not absolutely sure that there's been a lot of that, and it may be that there is some role for even the reactive policing of the travel regulations. If it stops some people from going out who would otherwise go out and shouldn't be going out, then there may be a place for that. But that increasing band, and there's some very respectable voices in it saying there should be no restrictions. Unfortunately, the respectable voices are joined by those that are extreme libertarians that say, government shouldn't be doing anything at all, and let's all just fend for ourselves. I mean, that's obviously not a position that the government could possibly take. So it's that tricky position that police find themselves, and the government find themselves in the Parliament too, between those who say more and send them all to jail, and those who say abandon all of these regulations and just let us do what we think is sensible. It's a collective response that's required to a situation like this, and policing caught between the two, I think, focus on the 4Es approach, and that keeps them right. It doesn't keep everyone else happy necessarily, but I think they're doing what they should be doing, having regard to the human rights principles and Police Scotland values.
Thanks very much. John, just a very brief question to Professor McVie. It was touched on earlier by John Scott about some of the challenges presented by having a regionalised approach. And I was just wondering whether in your data sets you're seeing lockdown fatigue leading to larger numbers of enforcement ultimately being required, even if that seemed to be proportionate and after the other 3Es have been worked through. But I was wondering whether Professor McVie could shed any light on those sorts of numbers.
Thank you. It's very difficult to tell how much fatigue there is, because what we don't have is good underlying population data about behaviour. We know that from a general level, the vast majority of people are complying with the regulations, either all or most of the time. We also know that lots of people have, found it difficult to comply with all of the regulations for one reason or another. There's anecdotal evidence that tolerance of the regulations is waning a bit, both in terms of population behaviour, where we perhaps are seeing a bit more kind of flexing of the rules in certain places, which is why I think we're seeing some increases in the spread of the disease in some areas more than others. There's also some anecdotal evidence of, tolerance waning amongst police officers. So there may be an increase in use of fixed penalty notices as a result of officers feeling increasingly kind of strained at having to tell the same people the same thing over and over again. It's very difficult to put any kind of number on it. I would say that there's anecdotal evidence, but not much more beyond that. What we do see in the data, though, is that patterns of use of enforcement continue to follow a pattern where they're used at peak times only. So they spike at particular times, such as round about weekends or particular football fixtures or these sorts of things. So it's certainly not being used indiscriminately. I think that the continued policing approach around the 4Es means that even where there's a kind of lack of tolerance in some communities, the police are continuing to use a very measured approach to using enforcement only when absolutely necessary.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that. Our next series of questions are from Margaret Mitchell. Margaret, please.
Thank you, Convener. My first set of questions is to Professor McVie. Professor McVie, in your opening remarks, you referred to Police Scotland's coronavirus intervention database system as being unique. And in their evidence, Police Scotland refer to the data on engagement and enforcement and state the system provides a more nuanced view of policing activity, as well as providing context around the amount of an activity undertaking. Is that a fair assessment, or were there constrictions on the amount and depth of the research you were tasked with carrying out? For example, was the data on the use of fixed penalty notices broken down by the type of crime provided as the regulations expanded their use? And this is of particular interest to me, as Lanarkshire had the highest rate of FPNs and was the only division to show an increase in complaints. Professor McVie.
Thank you. The information that was provided to me on the fixed penalty notice tickets didn't give me any information on the nature of the incident itself. To my knowledge, that type of information isn't recorded on the paper ticket itself, although I'm sure that there probably is further information that Scotland hold that wasn't issued. So I'm not able to answer any questions about the particular types of incidents other than information on the locus where it occurred, whether it was an indoor locus or an outdoor locus. There was some other information specifically on where incidents took place, but not in relation to the actual circumstances of the tickets being issued. I think you have to bear in mind that the information that Police Scotland provided to us through the optical group was subject to resource constraints. The database itself was created entirely from scratch by officers who put quite a lot of resource and time into creating the database. And at times in the course of our deliberations, we've had to be very careful, especially as time has gone on, we've had to be very careful about the amount of information we can ask officers to provide, given that things have gone back to business as usual to some degree, so the level of resource that we have in terms of data provision is lower.
Thank you for that, but I think it would be rather worrying if we weren't able to establish exactly what type of offences were covered with this. As we know, new offences and more serious offences were now were able to be dealt with under fixed penalty notices. But more specifically, in terms of the coronavirus intervention database system reporting and providing context, Police Scotland's stats record contact child sexual abuse during the lockdown as decreasing by 24.5% compared to the same period last year. And this at a time when children who are the victims of family-related sexual abuse are locked up with their abusers, and when the overwhelming consensus from support organisations, the NSPCC, Interpol, etc., is that child sexual abuse has increased, and not just online during the pandemic, but in contact situations. As such, these stats are dangerously misleading. So can I ask you what evaluation you were able to make of the stats and their context, and more generally, is it now time to review how Police Scotland records child sexual abuse incidents, given the very low percentage of this abuse which is reported directly to the police? Professor McVie.
Okay, thank you. So to tease out, the coronavirus intervention system was not used to collect that type of information. It was purely used to collect information on COVID-related interventions. So the information on child sexual abuse would have been recorded through the standard calls and incident system that Police Scotland have. So just to disentangle those two things. There was a decline in reporting of child sexual abuse. There was no, if my recollection serves, especially during that initial period, I don't think there was any decline in the proportion of domestic violence over that period of time, at least not significantly. Of course, the data that the police collect is contingent on reporting. So if these things haven't been reported to the police, then they wouldn't have been recorded. I do think that there are significant issues with the extent to which domestic violence has been concealed during the lockdown period as a result of, as you say, perpetrators and their victims being situated together for longer periods of time. It's very difficult for the police to deal with that if these things are not reported to them. That requires a much better integrated partnership approach, which I am aware that the police do have with their partner organisations. But I'm not sure how much I can say about in relation to your question, because it was out with the scope of the advisory group. Our particular remit was to look specifically at the use of the temporary powers, rather to look at wider policing issues in relation to what was happening around either child sexual abuse or other types of crime. So it's not something the advisory group has been focusing on. So I feel a little bit ill-equipped to answer your question.
Thank you, I appreciate that, but it is an issue that I think urgently needs looked at, because the fact is police have reported child sexual abuse has decreased, and that's counterintuitive to the information that we have from every other reliable source, and something that needs addressed. Convener, I'm happy to leave my question for Mr. Scott to the end if that's helpful.
Okay, Margaret, yes, no, I got that message. We'll come back to you later. Fulton, you have a supplementary.
Sorry, yes, thanks, Convener. I mean, it's really just coming on the back of Margaret's question there, and to support her as a colleague on the same cross-party group. Margaret shared some of the stats that she's referred to there with members of the cross-party group on adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and I think she made the case very well that the organisations who work in this area were very, very concerned with that. I've already heard the answer, and I know that it was out with the scope and remit, but I suppose, is there anything there that, and we understand that reporting might have been different for these type of offences during the lockdown, and that contact between children and possible perpetrators might have been different as well if they weren't within the same household. But given what we know about this type of abuse and that it can happen within the household, is there any recommendations that can be done on reporting, such as further linking up with social work services or education services, which have obviously also had their issues during the pandemic? Is there any comment that can be made on that, so that we can perhaps capture more of these offences, these very serious offences, and alleviate the concerns that some of the stakeholders have in relation to these figures? Just if there's anything further to add to how you've already answered, Margaret.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I know that data linkage is something that's being actively discussed at the moment by the Justice Board, in terms of both in research terms and in operational terms, in theory, greater data linkage across organisations which capture information around child sexual abuse should enable that kind of wider partnership approach, and potentially allow further or more cases to be reported to Police Scotland. But all I can say, based on my knowledge, is that there's ongoing work around that area of data linkage.
Thank you, Professor McVey. I don't think any criticism of your work inferred by that. The acquisition of data, of course, is a hugely important issue. We can maybe pick that up, members. It is a very important matter. Let's maybe pick it up during a private session. We're a wee bit behind schedule, getting to be a fair bit behind schedule. The next questions are from Rona Mackay. Rona, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. My first question is to Professor McVey, please. In your opening statement, I noted that you spoke of your concern over the data collection in deprived areas. Police Scotland have said that during the initial phase of lockdown, primarily it involved people living in the poorest parts of Scotland, and that should be balanced by highlighting that the data set was based on the recipient's home address and not where they were issued with the fixed penalty notice. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Yes, that is absolutely true, that the data reflected where the individual was living rather than the area in which the fixed penalty notice was issued. There was some reports by police officers themselves, particularly during those early phases of lockdown, that a lot of the response focused in some of the more deprived areas where there was an expectation that there might be greater problems with complying with the regulations. But there isn't. I'm not able to attach a deprivation locus to where the actual incidents occurred.
Okay, thank you. And just to follow up a wee bit on what my colleagues Fulton and Margaret were saying, I mean, are you satisfied that Police Scotland's data collection processes are robust enough? And are there areas where improvements could be made with regard to identifying vulnerable individuals or those with protected characteristics? Do you think that there has been enough emphasis put on that aspect of the collections?
Is this specifically in relation to coronavirus, or are you talking more generally?
No, just with coronavirus at the moment, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So certainly the data that was collected through the coronavirus intervention system, we know was not 100% accurate. There were particular reasons for that, particularly in terms of office pressure on officers to complete data input after a day shift. I think over time the data has become more accurate because more of the data is being collected through mobile devices rather than kind of manually. And the data that was collected through the fixed penalty notice data was fairly robust, and we know that by comparing it to courts data. In terms of data on protected characteristics, the police typically, I mean, I'm not aware that police systems collect data on all protected characteristics, but they do publish data based on age, sex and ethnicity. Those data are good for certain aspects of data collected by Police Scotland and maybe not for others. There are, as you will be well aware, ongoing issues with some of the police data systems which continue to rely on legacy systems from the previous 8 forces. There is an ongoing piece of work within Police Scotland to improve data collection and to ensure that it conforms to all GDPR and other requirements, particularly under collecting information on protected characteristics. But I would say that during the course of our work, there were some issues around getting access to the level of information that was requested by some of our members on the advisory group. For example, children and young people, I think there was a desire to get more detailed information on children and young people coming to the attention of the police during the pandemic. And there have also been issues in the past around getting access to protected characteristic data, but that's often more related to data systems rather than the actual data that's held itself. I think in relation to the fixed penalty notice data, the data is very good around protected characteristics in terms of what the police collect. I think there are wider issues around, for example, arrest data, where we haven't been able to get access to the level of information that's required, but that's primarily because of resource issues and issues relating to the way that arrest data is held, which is patchy across different systems.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Convener, I just have a very brief question for John Scott, if that's okay. It's really relating to a lot of the answers you've given to my colleagues about the complexities between legislation and guidance. But I just want to ask briefly, do you think that the government have got the balance right here between legislation and guidance? And you know, is legislation there to send out a message to the public just how seriously you know, the government and the police take this issue?
I think on balance, Ms Mackay, the government have got that right, because I think it's important not to have everything in regulations, so that there's some legislative restraint which has been shown by the government to allow space for people to do the right thing without facing the sanction of criminal penalty, and it allows more space for the first 3 E's as well. That if something is part of guidance, then of course it's never going to reach the 4th E, it's not going to be the subject of enforcement. But some of the time people have been speaking to police officers, or the police have been speaking to them, where it's a state of confusion. I mean, actually the police have become a resource, unfortunately, but realistically that's what's happened, for people that don't know what the regulations are, so phoning up the police to find out what the situation is in a particular area. And it's, from the government's point of view, it's not always necessarily in the interest of the messaging to say this is regulation, this is guidance. The government wants everyone to comply with the guidance, but I think what they've got right is that there's a gap there. As soon as you step over the guidance, you're not immediately liable to the penalties of the criminal law, and that is as it should be, because it's public health policing, it's public health legislation, it's not public order. So I think that legislative restraint, something we've commented on, and is welcomed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, convener.
Thank you. Now, our next questions are from Shona Robertson. Shona, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I just want to touch on the issue of the Central Statement of Mission and Values, which recognises the need to protect and respect the human rights of all, regardless of their personal characteristic status. That's Article 14. And my question is to Professor McVeigh about, do Police Scotland have a central statement of mission and values, and are they providing data on the use of restraint to allow the IAG to analyse whether the instances where restraint is being used has increased or not? And the data that the subcommittee received on the use of spit hoods would indicate that the use of this restraint has increased. It's just really to ask you whether you think that's a cause for concern.
I'm not sure about the use of restraint, and that information was provided as part of the submission to either this committee or previous committees. It's something that has been discussed to some extent within the advisory group. We are aware that the instance of use of spit hoods, for example, has increased during the course of the pandemic at certain points, but not extensively. I mean, we're not seeing hundreds and hundreds of people being subject to spit hoods. However, the data that's provided, I think, when we've asked for the information, it has been provided by Police Scotland.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a brief question for John Scott as well, which we've kind of touched on around the fact that imposition of restrictions may have had a significant impact on those who have got additional or particular needs. For example, individuals with learning difficulties or those who are victims of domestic abuse, which we have already touched on. And it's really, my question is whether you've been able to assess how Police Scotland has tailored its approach to deal with individuals in those circumstances. And we've touched on those who've suffered domestic abuse, but perhaps maybe referring to those with learning difficulties. And secondly, whether there's scope for further research in this area. To John Scott, thanks.
Thanks, Ms Robertson. Yeah, just briefly on the spit hoods point, it also, I think, appeared from the data that there have been an increase in the number of incidents of spitting as well. So no doubt the increased use of spit hoods is related to that. But our colleague on the group, Naomi McAuliffe from Amnesty International, has obviously taken a particular interest, as the organisation generally has, with, for example, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So far as those with learning disabilities or autism is concerned, we have on our group Tressa Burke from the Glasgow Disability Alliance and Katrina Stewart from the Scottish Women's Autism Network, and their assistance to the group has been tremendous. And they've reached out through their networks for general support and communication, and also to hear what concerns their members. The Glasgow Disability Alliance in particular should be commended, because at a point where digital exclusion is a real and serious issue, they made more than 5,000 phone calls to members of their network. And the feedback they got when they were asking very general questions, very little of it related to policing at all. In the early stages of the lockdown, there were some issues that were raised in the media and some issues that were raised with us about people with hidden disabilities who were being asked to move on when they were sitting down in a park, for example. And I think that was an example of some of the teething problems as the public and the police got to terms with what was and wasn't allowed. I think that's much better now, because what we're hearing from Katrina and Tressa and their networks is that their friends and colleagues are not really mentioning policing at all. They're far more concerned with the other demands of life during restrictions, concerned with health, concerned with work, concerned with benefits. There were some issues about the wearing of masks and some individuals who weren't able to wear a mask, and we sent a letter to the authority for onward transmission to the government, just to remember that there were people that wouldn't be able to, and to try and discourage an atmosphere of pointing the finger when that happened. As to the possibility of further research, well, in these areas, and as one of the themes that struck us overall, the support that is needed for more vulnerable members of society hasn't always been there when it should have been. And a lot of what we see is, we think those people who are not able to comply with restrictions because of their particular circumstances, because they're unable to, and isolating is a good example. Those who have the choice between isolating because they're supposed to, or quarantining, or going to work, and if they don't go to work, they've got no money. And so those choices make it very difficult for some people to actually comply with the restrictions. And I think more can be done. It actually also, I think, may even impact on the question about the reduced reporting of child sex abuse, because some of the networks and the groups were affected as well. And as Mrs. Mitchell was saying, the individuals, sometimes they won't go to the police, but they'll go to their local group or their networks or churches, for example. And all of these have been affected by the restrictions too. So underreporting and lack of support are in part because of the effect on key community groups in being able to listen to their people, and also then in suitable cases reporting on or reporting to other parts of the authority or the local authority about particular support that's needed. So I would imagine that if Tressa Burke was here, she would be saying, yes, more research is needed, because if this doesn't go away entirely, or if it's going to come back, and frankly, even if it wasn't, even if we completely deal with the coronavirus, with COVID-19, then actually there are groups in society who need more support and effort, and these are groups who suffer when it comes to health and all sorts of other respects and general deprivation. So I think that there's certainly a case for further research about how to support people in general, and perhaps in particular given our focus through something like this pandemic.
Thank you. That's all from me, Convener.
Thank you. Before coming to Margaret for the final question, I wonder, can I direct a question to Mr. Scott, and before doing so, refer to my register of interests as a long-standing member of Amnesty. Mr. Scott, the issue of Spitheads has been referred to a couple of times. I don't know if you're cited on Amnesty's evidence. It's particularly the fact that, and it's acknowledged that there's disparate sources and systems, but I wonder, would you have anticipated that information on the number would be something that's routinely gathered, and that Police Scotland wouldn't, as they've said, and I quote here, "Please be aware these statistics were gathered recently for the purposes of a parliamentary question, as the research would otherwise have attracted Section 12, which relates to excessive costs, exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act." Could you comment on that? And I don't know if you feel able to comment on any risk analysis that should be ongoing about. Obviously, officers need to be protected from the vile practice of spitting, but I fear personally that it's only a matter of time before we have a tragedy if we keep putting bags over people's heads. But I wonder, can you comment on the information, the cost, and whether there should be an ongoing assessment, please?
Of course, thank you, Convener. I would have thought that it's information, it's data that should be kept on an ongoing basis, and although there's been an increase in the numbers, I don't think the numbers are so great as to rule that out for reasons of the demand on resources. So far as the practice itself is concerned, as I said, I think I did see Amnesty's evidence to the committee, and Naomi has mentioned it at the IAG. I think risk assessment is still done. I recall seeing correspondence from Police Scotland to Amnesty on the issue, saying that bithoods were not being issued specifically in relation to the pandemic. So I think that there's a risk assessment done in general terms, and I rather suspect that it's more related to what unfortunately appears to be an increase in the number of spitting incidents. And with some who come into contact with the police, they are doing whatever they can to make life difficult for the officers, and unfortunately spitting, which I think the Federation have spoken to the committee about, put into evidence about as well, has increased. And I share concerns about the use of spit hoods, but equally concerns for officers and their safety when they're on the front line of the pandemic, and where very often an individual may spit in their face and say, I've got coronavirus, and then all of the serious concerns and worries that officers have arising from that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Our next question is from Margaret Mitchell. Margaret, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Scott. Recent press reports have shown that Police Scotland have had to deal with some serious infractions of the regulations, for example, with regard to house parties and illegal raves. Is restriction fatigue a real concern for Police Scotland, challenging the feasibility of police engagement before enforcement? And what assessment have you made of what appears to be, at the very least, a disconnect between the Chief Constable and the Scottish Police Federation regarding the extent to which the health, safety and well-being of frontline police officers and their families is being adequately protected in policing of indoor events during the pandemic?
Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. So far as the parties and the gatherings are concerned, it is worth mentioning that Police Scotland on a weekly basis publish data about gatherings which are dispersed on direction, gatherings which are dispersed without direction, and fixed penalty notices and arrests. I'm not sure. I think, unfortunately, that the fact that data is there wasn't widely known. The BBC put in a Freedom of Information request, and then there was a story several weeks, or I think maybe even months after that data had been published, and it said, well, there's been 3,000 parties or whatever. But actually, that was a number that obviously increased over time, and you could observe the increase by looking at the weekly publication of the data. So I think it perhaps gave a misleading impression. It also was a good example of misuse of Freedom of Information request. Maybe the first thing to do in that situation is to have a look at the website and see if it's there. So Police Scotland were being open about the data. Inevitably, there's going to be a degree of fatigue. Although we've heard, as the government and others have, and Police Scotland have, from Professor Steve Reicher, and I think it can be overstated. I think maybe more of an issue now is the increasing number of people who are saying, we're not putting up with it anymore, or those who say, well, whatever happens, whatever the regulations are, I'm having Christmas the way I would normally have it. So there are certainly challenges there. I think it is still, Police Scotland will still be able to deal with that. But absolutely, the 4Es approach is important, and reflecting either flagrant, egregious breaches or repeated breaches may see an acceleration through the 4Es. On the point between the Chief Constable and the Police Federation, I've seen some of the correspondence, I've heard some of the evidence. It's very difficult for me to judge, other than that as part of our work, Jill Emery, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, Chief Inspector of Constabulary, did interviews with Police Scotland officers and other Police Scotland staff, and that was back in, I think it was June. And it featured in a report for I think the end of June meeting of the SPA board. And there were no, it was an interview with particular questions, but if other things had come up, we would have noted them. I don't think that there were particular concerns mentioned then about PPE, for example. I've spoken to Calamat, the Federation, about it, so I'm aware of their concerns. But I've also heard what the Chief Constable has to say about it, and I'm simply not in a position. It's not something that we've been looking at. It's not really something that, other than in the passing, has crossed our radar, and so it's not really something I'm able to comment on.
I merely asked Mr. Scott because it was one of the Chief Constable's 3 overriding priorities in dealing with the pandemic. So I would have thought then it would have been something that would have attracted IAG's attention, and to hopefully get definitive answer. But if I may, Convener, just before we end, as the chair of the Independent Advisory Group, the information that we refer to today from the child sexual abuse contact statistics on this reported 24.5% decrease was given to the committee in response to our last evidence session on 20th of August, where we asked to provide detail in relation to the steps being taken to identify these vulnerable witnesses. And under the impact of lockdown on criminality, these figures have come out, which are really very, very misleading and dangerous. You could reach the conclusion from this that actually lockdown protected these very vulnerable young people. As such, can I have your views on this and how this can be looked at moving forward? Because it's a serious issue with legislation that is supposed to be at the heart protecting public health.
Of course, Mrs. Mitchell, I think, as Professor McVie said, it's out with our terms of reference, which is the exercise of the emergency powers. But in respect to the question and my own impressions gathered from a variety of sources, I think that it is misleading. I don't imagine at all that there has been such a significant reduction in these serious crimes. If anything, I would have thought that there was a real risk that there was an increase in it. But I go back to what I said about it is known that it is or can be very difficult for people to report these things, and in particular in the context of coercive control or abusive relationships, especially where locked in with the abuser. It may be that there is a lot of this, I suspect it's likely there's a lot of this which hasn't been reported anywhere, and which we will hear about, at least some of it, when things change. I have been able to see Police Scotland and the government making significant efforts to try and encourage people to report it, but that, to an extent, is despite the reality for people of just how difficult it is. And I go back to the point about where some individuals feel that they can't go to the police about it. They might have felt that they could share with friends or community groups or the church. And a lot of those groups and networks have been prevented from working because of lockdown and restrictions as well. So the channels for people, other channels apart from official reporting for people to use, have either not been there or have been taken up with other things. And as to the solution for that, I'm afraid I don't know. I suppose I'm simply echoing your concerns in terms of the committee about the problem, and in particular the masking of the problem by data, which I agree doesn't give us the true picture.
Thank you for that, and I think at the very least we can expect from Police Scotland not to release information that could actually be adding to the problem, as opposed to looking at ways they can reflect the actual extent of this problem. Something for the future, perhaps, Mr. Scott. Thank you. Convener.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session. I'm sorry to our participants to overrun a bit, but it's been very interesting and extremely helpful to the committee to get a wide-ranging understanding about the work you're doing, for which we're very grateful. So I thank Professor McVeigh, I thank Mr. Scott for providing the evidence to the subcommittee today, and that concludes the public part of our meeting. The next meeting of the subcommittee will be on Monday, 7th December, when we will take evidence from Dame Eilish Angelini on the report of the Independent Review of Complaints Handling, Investigations and Misconduct issues in relation to policing. In the meantime, any follow-up scrutiny issues will be dealt with by correspondence, which as ever will be published on our website. As previously agreed, I will now move the meeting into private session. Thank you.